Hey everybody, Joshua Hatton here. Listen, before we get into today's episode, which I promise will be all sorts of fun and geeky and funny and all that stuff, I wanted to reach out to you all on a very serious note. My friend and next door neighbor, unfortunately, was in an accident at a local beach. A wave had taken him, as well as the undertow, and threw him against the ground and unfortunately snapped his neck. He's been in the hospital for a bit over 2 weeks now. First intubated, now they have a trach. He can't really talk on his own. He can't really breathe on his own. He can't really move. Just to give you an idea as to how serious this is, they're in conversations with the Christopher Reeves Foundation to see what his life is going to look like from here on out. That being said, there is a lot of hope. He's got his wife Linda and his 3 kids, and they're all supporting him, and we want to support him too. They've got a GoFundMe set up right now, and I wanted to share that link with you all just in case you were interested in helping and donating to them as they try to deal with or grapple with their medical bills. So if you're interested in donating, my friend's name is John Van Steenbergen. And the GoFundMe, I actually made a bit.ly link for you just to try to make it a little easier. I'll post it in our Facebook group page, but I wanted to list it here too in case you had a pen, piece of paper, something like that. You can write it down. The link is bit.ly, so a bit.ly link, /3, and then lowercase v as in Victor, Y as in yellow, I as in indigo, and then uppercase V as in Victor, uppercase H as in Haida, and uppercase V as in Victor. Again, that link is for my friend John Van Steenbergen, who unfortunately broke his neck and is in a lot of need right now. Not expecting you to give. Should you give? I thank you. His family thanks you. Appreciate your time listening to this and all your support. So listen, let's hand it off to the show. Cheers. Thanks so much. Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey Podcast. I'm joined today, and I'm joined, as always, by, not with, but by, because we're not conjoined, my good friend, my business partner, my Catoctin Creek shirt-wearing White Walker, Jason Johnston Yellen. How are you, sir?
I tell you, dude, if you start naming the T-shirts I'm wearing during recording, it's going to get repetitive really soon because I circle 3 black shirts. The Catoctin Creek that I'm currently wearing, the Backwoods that you and I both agree is a great shirt, and Single Cask Nation. Those are the 3 shirts that I rotate.
Do you not wear the King Sheep shirt? I wear that.
Oh, occasionally. Yeah, but that has not been in rotation much this summer. I did look at it in my drawer the other day, to be honest with you, but
I wore it the other day. I went out. I was in public with it even.
There you go. Did people follow you?
No, they just mocked me. So for our listeners, the shirt.
Yeah, for the listeners,
the shirt on the front has a cartoon profile of a sheep with a crown on it, and it just says on the front, "I am a sheep," and then on the back,
I'm a sheep. That's it. I'm a sheep.
And on the back it says, "Follow me."
It does indeed.
Yeah, it does indeed. Follow me.
Yeah, it's from my very good friend Pat Johnson, and a comic book that he did with Nate Taylor. Mm-hmm. Nate Taylor's artwork is really good, good, and we sponsored a Kickstarter of theirs years ago.
8 years ago, at
maybe
least
even more than that.
Yeah,
and the T-shirt came with that, and so I've got the hardbound collection of their comics. So yeah. If anybody wants to have a Google search, Google King Sheep and Comics, Nate Taylor, Pat Johnson, see what you see.
And just really quickly, seeing as we're talking about this, I had a large King Sheep shirt, but I also had a medium as well. And I now because of all the running I do, fit quite comfortably into that medium. Now,
Or into the large. Gotcha.
What's that?
You now fit comfortably into the large. Well done.
Well, I fit comfortably into the medium, but that got me thinking about our friend Mitch Wilson from Black Tot. So he had these really cool Black Tot shirts that, this was right as we're starting to come out of the pandemic, which I'd argue we're still coming out of the pandemic and things, right? This isn't... Anyway, and, bars were opening up. Remember that? Like, bars were opening up and there were limited hours and, they were like, let you support your bar, support your bartender, things like that. And so they had made these shirts that, Black Tot shirts that say, your bar needs you. And there would be like these... drawings of a bartender or a barista or whatever, making cocktails for you. Anyway.
Baristas making cocktails? What world is this?
Well, that's a good point, right? I guess.
You hate the word mixologist so much, you would substitute in the word barista instead.
It's a cocktail. So there you go. So it was actually coctologists. There's a male coctologist and a female coctologist.
That makes sense. Yeah. And who makes a cocktail? A coctologist.
A coctologist makes sense. Yeah.
Who inspects your prostate? A proctologist.
Right? So anyway.
These are all just words.
So I really liked the shirts, especially the one with the female bartender on it, because she's kind of got a profile and she's shaking her cocktail shaker, and it kind of looks like that old, we can do it kind of thing.
Oh, okay.
You know what I'm talking about? The old war effort thing?
Yeah, it looked much more like a shake weight commercial that you were modeling there.
Anyway, so I asked Mitch for a shirt. He said, yeah, no problem. What size do you wear? And I said, well, thank God I'm a medium these days. So he gave me 2 shirts, and I look at the tag, and it said L. And I'm like, you know what? He's so nice. He gave me 2 shirts. He didn't give me 1. He gave me 2. He gave me the one with the male coctologist and the one with the female coctologist. I'm like, whatever. And so I put one of the shirts on, and it fit perfectly. And I'm like, oh, no, am I back to a large without me even knowing it? And then I look back at the tag, and when you look closely, it
was a child's large.
It had 2 sizes. It said LEUMUS. So it's medium.
Talk about damning with faint praise.
But it goes to show you that Einstein's theory of relativity is in fact true. It not just applies to time and space, but one's own, sense of body. Right?
I thought you were suggesting you were so large you could bend light around yourself.
Changing subjects really quickly. So I've got 2 questions for you, but
yes, sir.
I want to lead with my first question. The second question has to do with today's guest. The first question has to do with...
So if I'm following correctly, you're going to ask your first question first and your second question second, just to make sure I'm following?
Yes. And
Okay.
First question has 2 words. First word has 1 syllable. Second word has 2 syllables.
Do you know what podcasters don't do enough of?
What's that?
Mime. I think all podcasters are missing a trick there. So I am ready. The listeners and I are ready for this mime.
Do you think mimes have their own podcast network? It's like 45 minutes of silence. And they tell you it was a great episode, but they can't tell you it was a great episode.
I tell you already framed this episode beautifully with your shake weight mime. So we are really rocking at this episode.
Whoever
yes, please continue.
Shake weight really enjoys male masturbation. Anyway, so I'm not wrong.
Who doesn't?
I'm not wrong. Am I wrong?
Okay, I've got a Walter moment happening here. Carry on, Walter.
So my first question for you is regarding our most recent trip to Black Button Distillery. Mm-hmm. Now, this is something that you had said, I think to either Jason or Alex at Black Button, where we kind of did the release of a black button whiskey in reverse. Where normally, right, we start a relationship with the distillery.
Yeah.
We get in with them, we talk about what we want to do, and then we release the whiskey. We released a black button whiskey, and then we went to visit them. We were with them just about a week and a half ago, and we got to visit their still house, one of their warehouses. We went to visit their malt stir. We got to do a lot of drinking with them, taste some cask samples. So my question to you is, what was two things. What was the highlight for you from what you understood about bourbon production? And what was the thing that took you by surprise from our visit with them?
So the second one's being surprised. What was the first part of this first question?
Well, we've been to our fair share of bourbon distilleries. What about their distillery stood out to you, having been to other distilleries? So by comparison to the other distilleries we had been to.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question here, but.
I know you asked me a question, but I said, fuck that. I'm going to answer something else.
It's a point of commonality.
Okay.
Which is when you walk in that door, the first thing you hear is, we are a small operation. We don't have enough space to do the things we've wanted to do. Mm-hmm. We are in the processes of moving to a larger facility. When we first came in here, we never imagined filling the space, and holy moly. And that's something you hear from smaller producer to smaller producer, and they're 10 years into this. Yeah. And I think it's always such a telling statement, because there's how do you simply start this thing? And back to our conversation with Jason that was a few episodes ago, right? How do you just simply one day start owning, operating, running, distilling at a distillery, right? There has to be that first day. And the reason that it always strikes me is because of you and me, right? When we talk to people and we look back after now 11 years, I can't imagine starting this tomorrow, right? Yeah. The fact we ever took that first step, and it was 3 casks, and we had no members. You know, at one point we obviously had no members because we had no single cask nation. And so to see the growth, and it gives me an opportunity to think about our growth and bringing people in. And so that's kind of my initial sense in walking into a new facility and meeting ostensibly new people, seeing Jason in the flesh, seeing Alex in the flesh, is that kind of, this shit takes off, and you have to keep growing, and you have to move, and you have to stay alert, you have to stay on your feet. And so that was kind of my first striking moment, was the commonality of it all. And you, and I know you've got a second question that second part to that question, but what was your kind of this moment? Yeah,
my answer to that question is far less introspective than yours is. Mine was looking at the still, and I'll post a picture of it because I took a picture of the still. You know, seeing this combination of a pot and a column still, and the thing that struck me the most, and I almost like, Jesus, after your answer, this almost feels stupid, but was looking at the line arm and how incredibly small and narrow the line arm was. And it reminded me of when Elijah and Johnny and I went to Westward Distillery, and they had this massive pot still with this tiny itsy bitsy little line arm that made for such a wonderful spirit. And I'm sort of kicking myself now, you know, looking back. I didn't make that connection at first when I was at Black Button, so I didn't get the opportunity to ask about the line arm. But when I was at Westward, I did ask specifically about the line arm, at which point you'd say, here's a perfect opportunity for Joshua to tell me what he remembers from this conversation about the line arm, and I'd remember fuck all. But I remember it was interesting.
Well, pleasingly, regular listeners of the podcast are saying it's always the line arm with Joshua. It's always the line arm.
God, you've been holding that for a while, since this whole thing.
As soon as you said it was so small, just classic Joshua.
But I
yes, go on.
Having been in their warehouse and tasted through some of their bourbons, some of the malt that they did, because they did do some single malt, and tasting the spirit, it's big, right? It is a bigger spirit, which makes me again wonder what that line arm is doing with it being so small. God damn it, Jason! I can't. You're such a 9-year-old boy right now. You're such a 9-year-old boy.
Big spirit from a small line arm. That's gosh. But you're right. You're right. It is a.
You'll give me that. Okay, good.
It is a big spirit. I've been racking my head. I've been taking advantage of you waxing lyrical about big spirits from small line arms. To think about your second part, which is what was most surprising, and every setup is unique and unto itself. But I feel like
chicken tonight, chicken tonight.
I don't feel like I was surprised by anything. Like the outgrowing the space within a decade, the needing more warehousing, the fact that everybody was lovely and everybody was deep into the craft of what they were producing. The fact that the tasting room was a lovely place to hang out. Okay, I'll tell you what. And this actually, I said this on site, and then it's built into their branding.
Okay.
Which is New York's urban farm distillery. I didn't think we were visiting a distillery on the very edge of downtown Rochester. I thought we were going out into the country amongst fields because we talked about farming so much.
Yeah, sure.
We talked about grain so much back in our interview with Jason. And so I just had it. A little corner of my brain had the farm aspect of it without the urban aspect of it. And so
got it.
And so that was a little bit of a surprise for me, and that was entirely on me. That I don't think they misled me in any way. And that's why I point out the fact in their own branding is New York's urban farm distillery. It's right there. So, and then they're moving about a mile away from where they currently are.
Yeah.
So it'll still be New York's urban farm distillery. So that, there you go. I would say that surprised me.
Okay.
Amongst a host of other things that were not surprising, including the absolute quality of the human beings.
The thing that grabbed my attention was them wanting to take us to see their maltsters. And this is something that Matt Hoffman from Westland had wanted to do, right? And I thought it was so interesting that they have both Black Button and Westland have such a tight connection with their maltster. And so visiting the Murmuration maltsters just maybe 30 minutes from their distillery.
Judd and Emily?
Yeah, Judd and Emily. And seeing their operation was super cool. But there was a specific part of the operation, something I'd never seen before, and they were malting corn. Now, granted, that wasn't for Black Button's use. It was for a local brewery. But it's one of those moments, and we say this all the time, you know, we've visited plenty of distilleries, and we continue to visit more and more different distilleries. And there's always something that says, oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's interesting. They're doing this different. They're doing that different. And you're always learning stuff that's new. But that's always been very distillery centric, where here we learned a lot of new stuff from a maltster perspective and what they're doing with grain, not just with the malted corn, but how they're soaking the barley. And gets me thinking, we've got to get a maltster on here and start
100%.
talking about the magic that happens in malting.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things we assumed we would have done by this point.
Yeah.
And as we both stood there with Judd and Emily, it was kind of like, why don't we have our remote recording equipment on us right now? Like,
It was in the hotel room.
Right. We both kind of had that sense of, oh, this is more than we anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
This, and you and I say it all the time to each other when we're out and about, our listeners would be digging this conversation. We said it to Judd,
Yeah.
at the beginning of that conversation, like, if our listeners could hear you right now, this is fantastic. So we'll circle back on that, and we'll make sure we'll get Judd, hopefully Emily, on the podcast to talk.
Yeah, it was a
malting.
wild conversation. And I loved one of the things that he said. He would talk about the different steps of malting and different things you do from many different perspectives. But he said, I'm not a malt. What did he say? He said, this is not a scientific approach. I don't know the science behind it, which I thought was very, very cool.
When he did.
Right. When he did, right? Like, I think he understood. I think what he meant to say is he didn't know how to necessarily explain why, from a scientific perspective, it was happening, but yet it was happening. And it makes me think of, fantastic guitar players or piano players who've never taken a lesson in their life. They just pick up the instrument and know what to be doing and know how to work with it. And that's the sense that I got from Judd.
Yeah, there was definitely this aspect of malting is as much art as science, and you're paying attention to every bit of grain that comes in, and really every batch that comes in, and differences in moisture levels, and how are they actually germinating, and how quickly are they moving, and what's the heat of the day like. And so there's a lot of moving parts, and I don't think you could just open the malting manual and malt the exact same way day in and day out. And that was kind of my takeaway from him, was you got to be listening to the grain, and you got to be responding to the needs of the grain. And that's, yes, there's science happening there, but there's also an art, as you rightly say, I think, about musicians and how you respond to how you perform and how you put your art in play. So brilliant. Yep, we'll circle back to this. There's no doubt about it.
So then my second question for you, Jason, is today's guest.
Yes, indeed.
You brought this person and their book to my attention.
I did.
And again, we're taking another detour, and thankfully our listeners have been following us along this ride and the various detours that we take. So I wonder if you can set the stage for us.
Yeah, actually, I wondered that exact question when I kind of started the book and thought, okay, we're going to bring an author on here, and authors are, kind of not our normal guest around here. But it is a book dedicated to someone who operated during Prohibition, who was the biggest bootlegger in the United States during Prohibition.
Yeah.
And the more I read the story, and it's narrative nonfiction, and so the more I'm reading this story, the more I'm thinking, oh, this is in the wheelhouse of One Nation Under Whiskey. This is what we talk about. And gosh, look at what we cover in Extra Extra as well, where we're talking about, decisions being made in 2022 on the back of pre-prohibition laws.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes I feel like we're shackled by the remnants of Prohibition.
Yeah.
So the book is written by Karen Abbott.
Okay.
The title is The Ghosts of Eden Park. This is actually the second book I've read by Karen Abbott in the last, say, 12 months. The first one is Sin in the Second City. And it's about a pair of sisters who open, in the old language, a house of ill repute in Chicago, in very early doors Chicago as well. And they just make it the best. It's got class. It's got, high-end furnishings. They became the envy of their little pocket of Chicago. And so Sin in the Second City is fantastically well told and is also narrative nonfiction. Yes.
Well, when I think of a house of ill repute, I'm thinking, best little whorehouse in Texas.
Exactly, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly that. Exactly. And so it is. Yeah, it's prostitution in turn of the 20th century Chicago.
Yeah. Yep.
When Chicago was as much a stockyard as it was a burgeoning city.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So she told that story fantastically well. Then I saw The Ghosts of Eden Park, got into reading about George Remus and bootlegging.
There you go, George Remus. There's a name that comes to the fore nowadays with the George Remus bourbon out there.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So yeah, I thought it was a very natural fit. I reached out. We settled on an interview date, and what you're about to hear is something that I think is really special in getting to sit and talk to an author about their process, their journey, just like we do with anybody in the whiskey industry.
Yeah.
But then going down the path of the actual story and talking prohibition and talking bootlegging. And I highly recommend this book to our listeners. It's absolutely in your wheelhouse. If you're the type of person to take the time to listen to a podcast about whiskey, go read a narrative nonfiction from Prohibition and bootlegging era.
That's awesome. Yeah, my only wish/regret was that I was able to conduct this interview along with you, but as you know, I was traveling with Madhu Khanna from Indri Distillery, and so while you were having your conversation, I was having my conversation. So we'll have a future episode with Madhu Khanna of Indri. And so today we have your interview with the author, Karen Abbott.
So welcome to the podcast. We keep referring to you, Joshua and I, as the author Karen Abbott, because that's the name that appears on the two books I've read, Sin in the Second City and now The Ghosts of Eden Park. But I know you as Abbott Kahler, and there's a bit of a story behind that. Would you regale us with that story?
Sure, I'm happy to regale. But first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I'm really excited to be chatting with you. Always nice to connect with another whiskey and history aficionado. So the story behind the name change, this was about 2013. I got an email from a reader who said, "Do you know that if you Google yourself, it says you died in 2010?" So sure enough, I Google myself, which I advise no one to ever do. And there's a picture of me with a couple of my book covers, and it says died 2010. And it was super creepy. I think just the element of having my photo there too was very creepy, and also my alma mater. And I just, it was very weird. And at that time, I was also about to turn 40. I was considering a foray into fiction. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to change my name. And I actually went to the courthouse in New York. I spent, a couple visits to the courthouse changing my name. And it became official, I think, in late 2014, early 2015, that my real name is Abbott Kahler, my legal name. But I kept Karen Abbott on my nonfiction books just because I had at that time, a couple books in my past and didn't want to disrupt that. So I'm not quite sure what name I'm going to use going forward. Probably will keep Karen Abbott for nonfiction. I'm not sure, but I have a novel coming out as well, and that one will be under Abbott Kahler. But so that's the weird story. It was kind of creepy because I discovered, my books were under the picture in the Google search, but there was also books that I did not write that appeared next to mine, books with titles like Take Hold of Tomorrow and Farrington's Fortune. And like, clearly they were like bodice ripper, romancy type things that I did not write. So it turns out there is a British author named Karen Abbott. I have no idea if she's dead. I don't know what her story is, but we were being conflated. So the whole thing was just so kind of weird and creepy. I was like, what, have I been weekend at burning for the last few years? I didn't realize I was actually dead. But it was just kind of an impetus for me to make that change, which, now was in my personal life and now will be in my professional life.
So I was curious about, as you just said a second ago here, you've got this author's name, Karen Abbott, out there in the wild. That's who people talk about. That's who people recommend to one another. And I was curious with this name change, what it would mean for your authorial identity going forward. But you're thinking you might keep that Karen Abbott on the next nonfiction?
Something I'm going to just talk with my agent and my editor about. They are aware of the name change. Obviously, they all call me Abbott. But if it's going to disrupt, any readership I might have, I don't want to do that. So, but I try to put those kinds of business like questions out of my mind until the work is actually finished, because the business aspect of it is just so tedious and stressful, and you really just want to have fun doing the work. This is my favorite part of the process, where you're researching and we're just pulling everything together. And there'll be a time to think about those sort of more practical concerns, but I try to put that off as long as I possibly can.
Well, I certainly want to return to the upcoming nonfiction piece towards the end of today's chat. For the moment, I'm always curious about process. And we'll get to talking about the Ghosts of Eden Park in a moment, and we'll apply process to that. But I recently read a book by Sarah, and I'm blanking on the second name, but the book was called Process. And it went through maybe a dozen or 15 authors, and it really talked through how they did what they did. And the one thread that ran through it all was they were all pretty much tortured by the writing process. And in any given day, they would put it off for as long as possible. They would be in their office at 9 a.m. and they would spin pencils and they would go on social media and they would write letters to whoever needed correspondence. And then by maybe 3 o'clock, they would be like, oh shit, I gotta get something done for the day. And they'd work and they would hammer out a bunch of words for the day. And then they would come back in the morning and maybe edit what they had done the previous afternoon. Invariably, it was clocking off time by 5 p.m. so they could have a cocktail or something. And so I'm very curious, where do you fit within the world of process? What does that look like for you?
That's a good question. I'm a night owl, so I will often, wake up, have my coffee. I can't talk to anyone before. Like, the fact that you and I are speaking at 10 a.m. my time is I make it an exception for you, because usually I'm not capable of any coherent conversation. I guess it remains to be seen whether this is coherent or not. But anyway, I'm a night owl, so I will sometimes I'll get really start going around noon. And then I'll work until 8:30. So it's so funny. I'll have friends who say, "Hey, want to meet for happy hour?" And I'm like, "I'd love to, but it's the middle of my work day. I can't." I was like, "You want to meet at 9? Want to get a late nightcap?" But it's I also think that when people are procrastinating, a novelist friend of mine calls it stew potting. Even if you're ostensibly doing something else, your mind in the back of your mind, it's thinking about your story and your characters and what would organically happen next in your plot. And so I don't think all of that is wasted. I will clean. I'll walk around and clean in the morning, maybe sometimes, but at the same time, I'm thinking about, well, how am I going to start that next chapter? Or how can I change that dialogue? It's not quite right. This is in my fiction, of course. In my nonfiction, and I guess this is an interesting comparison. It's so much easier in a way because I don't have to make up dialogue. In fact, I can't make up dialogue. I have to adhere to what's in the historical record. You can't write bad dialogue in nonfiction, so it's impossible. But I'll do that. I will work until about 8:30. I keep a pad by my bed that if I wake up, I'm also a horrible insomniac. If I wake up in the middle of the night and I have a thought, I will make sure I can get it down because I've learned the hard way that it's sometimes those kinds of midnight epiphanies are very elusive and ephemeral.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll do that. And I try not to go back and edit what I did the day before, unless I know it's really, really off. If I think I ended it on an okay note, I'll keep going ahead because it's kind of like the more you distance you get from what you've done, the better and easier I think it is to go back and edit when you do go through it again.
Interesting.
So that's basically it. And I have my African gray parrot as my companion. He'll sometimes literally shit on my pages if they're spread out on the floor. If I'm looking at something, in a big picture way, I'll spread the pages on the floor. And if he shits on something, I have to take a second look at it. So that's pretty much my process.
Okay, so I'm curious to circle back here to what you were saying there about dialogue. Do you ever find that having the dialogue in front of you can sometimes paint you into a narrative corner? As someone who also writes fiction, do you ever think, oh, I wish they'd said that like this, and that would have allowed me to advance the narrative in this other way? Do you ever get trapped by that hard and fast non-fiction dialogue?
When you are writing nonfiction, especially historical nonfiction, sometimes the source material is so scarce that you are just happy to have any dialogue at all. It's one of the things I actually look for when I'm trying to decide which nonfiction story to do. What is the primary source material? And I have pretty specific criteria for what I think makes a good nonfiction book. The first one is, does it have a narrative arc? Could it read like a novel? Does it have are the stakes rising? Is there a beginning, middle, and end? Is there a great climax? That kind of thing. Could you work with what you have to structure it to the best of your ability as a novel? And usually, there are so many stories that. Let me just backpedal there. The second thing I look for is, like I said, primary source material. Do you have letters? Do you have diaries? Do you have memoirs? Do you have, the great thing is unpublished memoirs? Do you have a trial transcript? Do you have contemporary interviews with the person's, people the person knew at the time? And do you have the person's own words in a significant amount? And if you have those things, I think that you have those two components. I think that's what makes a good book. Because those primary source materials are giving you detail, and detail is everything. Detail is the most important factor in a nonfiction book. If you don't have the stuff, the source material to make for good detail, the book is just going to read really shallow and hollow and kind of just superficially. And I like to say, people who do what I do, who write historical nonfiction, are in the business of time travel. I want somebody to sit down with my book and kind of feel disoriented when they put it down. Oh, what time period am I in? And, I just was in 1927. I'm like, whoa, what is this television? And I just want people to really feel so immersed that it's almost kind of, a struggle to get back into the world. And you cannot do that without detail.
Well, and I think it goes in the other direction. Speaking personally, in starting the Ghosts of Eden Park, we start in 1927. And so I go from picking up the book in 2022 to, okay, I'm in a park in Chicagoland in 1927. You've already got me in that time machine. And now I'm asking myself the question, okay, who am I meeting now that I'm opening the door of this time machine?
So the main character in The Ghost of Eden Park is a man by the name of George Remus. I'm guessing a lot of your listeners who are big into whiskey and whiskey history probably know the name George Remus.
Especially in the last couple of years.
Yeah, definitely. And also, of course, he was a minor character on the television show Boardwalk Empire, which ran on HBO for about 5 seasons. And I think it was a really, I usually get my ideas from dusty old, archives and books and libraries and sort of perusing old newspapers. But I got the idea for the Ghost of Eden Park through Boardwalk Empire. I thought it was a great show. And once in a while, this minor character named George Remus would show up. And he was mostly used for comic effect. He was this very flamboyant, subdued but flamboyant in his own way, Prohibition king in Cincinnati. He spoke of himself in the third person. There was a great scene with him and Steve Buscemi's character, Nucky Thompson. They're wheeling and dealing. They're on the phone. Steve Buscemi's character is in New Jersey. Remus is in Cincinnati. And George Remus says to Steve Buscemi, actually, it's Glenn Fleshler, who plays a fantastic George Remus, says to Steve Buscemi's character, Remus finds you petty and resentful, in the third person. And Steve Buscemi's character says, oh, well, Remus can go fuck himself. It's just a great scene. And I wondered, there's so many like it. And I wondered if he was a real character. I had not heard of George Remus before that point. And indeed, George Remus was a real character in history. Indeed, he did speak of himself in the third person. And his real story, as I soon discovered, was so much more interesting and dramatic than anything that was portrayed on Boardwalk Empire. And I did a little digging to see what the primary source material was. And of course, I realized he would make a fantastic book.
Your head must have exploded when you started unraveling that story. To go from a minor character to everything that you discovered about George Remus.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when people think of Prohibition, they think of Al Capone, of course. They think of Chicago. They think of the outfit. They think of, his whole operation out there. And before Capone, there was George Remus. And in terms of just selling whiskey and distributing whiskey and operating a whiskey business during Prohibition, George Remus was the more successful bootlegger. He just kind of got lost to history, I think, because he was not as outwardly flashy as Capone. He did not order these really gruesome murders, St. Valentine's Day Massacre. George Remus considered himself, I think, above that sort of thing. If he was going to do any nasty business, it would have been very quiet and private. And, he wasn't going to publicize that fact. But George Remus's empire did not last very long. So he kind of easily got overshadowed by Capone. And I just thought you really can't talk about the fantastic decade of the 1920s without talking about George Remus. It's such a quintessentially American story. George Remus was a German immigrant, who came here and was dirt poor, had to quit school to help his family just make ends meet, and ends up, I think the most staggering statistic, there were a couple of them, but at one point, George Remus owned 33% of all of the alcohol in the United States. If you stop at it, 1/3 of the entire supply of the alcohol in the United States belonged to one person. And he made, somewhere in the ballpark of $30 million in that short time period. $30 million, not in today's money, in 1921 money, which is just a staggering. I can't even fathom how vast his fortune was.
Every time I read the numbers in your book, I reread them and I reread them again. And I did exactly what you just did there for our listeners, is I did that moment of, well, was that now money or was that then money? And the then money is breathtaking, absolutely breathtaking. And the parties that he threw as a result, the gifts that he gave as a result. I finished your book a couple of weeks ago. I still think about his New Year's Eve party.
Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun.
Describe.
That one was really a lot of fun. I mean, it kind of became, I think if anyone does know about George Remus, they often think about that New Year's Eve party. It's kind of the legend that really persevered. And I think partly because his lavish parties are one of the reasons that people believe he was an inspiration for F. Scott Fitzgerald in the creation of Jay Gatsby. And just to talk about these party favors for a minute, he had this grand New Year's Eve party in 1921, showing off his brand new renovated Cincinnati mansion. He gave out a diamond stick pin for all the men. All the women got a brand new car. Decades before Oprah, you get a car, and you get a car. All the women got a brand new car, and he put underneath each guest plate, he put $1,000 bill. And just to put that all into perspective, at that time, $1,200 was the average annual salary. And he put $1,000 bill under everybody's plate. And, there's no hard evidence that George Remus and F. Scott Fitzgerald ever met, although they were in Kentucky around the same time period. There's no hard evidence. But I think that the similarities between them are conspicuous. They both owned a string of pharmacies. They both were in love with an enigmatic woman. They both threw these lavish parties. And, Fitzgerald wrote that Gatsby sprang from a platonic conception of himself and that he kind of, longed to inhabit a world that didn't quite welcome him. And I think Remus was in the same boat. They both had that sort of sense of melancholy that sort of ran throughout their lives, that sense of not belonging.
But I also wonder if there's that sense of you have the money, but what else do you have? And there's that sense of who am I? What am I becoming? And the money seemed to become, and I'm talking for Gatsby and for Remus here, it seemed about more than the money for Remus, where it almost seemed like, even to him talking about himself in the third person, where he almost wanted to be known. He wanted to make a statement, and $1,000 bill under a dinner plate makes a statement. Do you get that sense from reading, and obviously writing, but also reading more of the source material as well?
Oh, absolutely. I think that it was very important for Remus to prove himself as a member of society. He wanted to be considered a respectable member of society. I think it's part of the reason he was talked about how the quality of his liquor. He was not putting, poison. He was not mixing his alcohol, diluting it with poison. He wanted people to know that he had the best liquor. You weren't going to get Jake Leg from drinking George Remus liquor. And it was important for him. He lived in Cincinnati and he wanted to be seen as somebody who might be able to mingle with the Tafts, that William Howard Taft, the former president, that he was in the Supreme Court at that time, and various other luminous families in the Cincinnati area. And just he really wanted to be respectable. He considered himself a businessman, a gentleman. And it was very important to him. And I think you're right that party was very symbolic for him. Here he is hosting a lavish party. It was, tasteful. It was extravagant, but it was, in his mind, classy. And he invited all of these luminaries. He invited all the important families in Cincinnati and judges and politicians and other people that he wanted to, he wanted to be accepted. And I think that was a very, very important concern to him.
For the benefit of the listener, the sound of a screech, almost a chair going across a hardwood floor, is I assume the grey parrot that you were talking about before we hit record.
Yes.
What's the name of the parrot?
His name is Dexter.
Dexter, named after the serial killer.
No, he's older than that show. Actually, he's 21. He was named after Pete Dexter, the novelist.
There you go.
I had another bird who passed away. Her name was Poe, of course, after Edgar Allan. So
there you go.
Yeah.
Is Dexter warming up for a morning constitutional here, or any of your pages under assault?
I don't know. My pages, luckily, are not printed out yet. I'm not at the phase yet where I'm printing. So I think he wants to join the conversation. Would you prefer if I bring him into my lap? He might stop screeching if I bring him over.
Whatever works for you. We are more than happy to continue with Dexter. It's easy peasy.
Okay. All right. I'm going to leave him there for now, but I think maybe he'll go back to sleep again.
Yeah, so. No, he's not a problem at all. And absolutely, he will be in for color as well, and give our listeners a chance to hear from Dexter.
Yes, he just wants to throw his 2 cents in.
So I want to tie in something you just said a second ago with Prohibition itself, which is he was clearly operating within a certain letter of the law. And yet he was engaged in the business of prohibition booze making and production. Do you get a sense that he did think he was legitimate? Was he doing enough within a certain letter to believe that in his own mind, even though he was clearly breaking the law? Maybe I'm overstating it now.
No. I mean, it's a very good question, because half of his operation actually was legal. The Remus, who was a defense attorney, a very actually successful defense attorney in Chicago before he became a bootlegger, used his pharmaceutical background and his legal background to scour the Volstead Act to look for a loophole. And he found the loophole. The loophole was that with a physician's prescription, it would be legal to, buy, manufacture alcohol, distribute alcohol, that kind of thing, for quote unquote medicinal purposes. It had to be for medicinal purposes. And so, there was a whole operation. The genius for Remus's operation was that half of it was legal. So he bought the string of pharmacies. He got government permits to access the whiskey that was bonded in the warehouses that before Prohibition, that government bonded whiskey. He legally got that out of the warehouses. And he had a fleet of trucks that were, bringing this alcohol to medicinal purposes, destinations, quote unquote. But the real genius of his plan was that he also had another fleet of trucks. And the second fleet of trucks would hijack the first fleet of trucks and steal all of the alcohol and divert that alcohol to the illegal market at any price that Remus named. So he's basically robbing Remus to pay Remus, which is why he called his enterprise the Circle. And it was sort of the genius of it. He found this loophole, he exploited it brilliantly. And they're so far along the process, it was all legal and fine. It's just at that very end when he had the hijacking and the diversion of the alcohol that things really stepped over the law.
So I have to be perfectly honest with you here. I read your book in 24, 36 hours. Like, I just absolutely destroyed it. I could not put it down. It literally was something I could not put down. But what that has led to is, earlier on when I talked about 1927 in Chicagoland, that might not be in Chicagoland, or were they back in Chicagoland at that point?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading my book so quickly and for the ringing endorsement. I appreciate it. But yes, the book starts in 1927 in Cincinnati. He met Imogene, who became his second wife. He met her in Cincinnati. She was the dust girl, quote unquote, in his office, which is what they called, I guess, the cleaning person at that time. And then they moved to Cincinnati because it was a strategic location. I think it was something like most of the country's pre-Prohibition bonded whiskey was stored in warehouses within 300 miles of Cincinnati. And so it just became a strategic location for him. It was a growing city. It was a transportation hub. You could easily reach other cities from Cincinnati. And then they're in Cincinnati from then on. So in 1927, which is actually, I open with a scene toward the end of the book. They are definitely in Cincinnati. In fact, they are in Eden Park in Cincinnati, which is which is the famous park in Cincinnati, and quite gorgeous and eerie. If anybody ever has the opportunity to go there to see some George Remus history, it's really a really interesting, eerie, beautiful spot.
Well, the other part I have to be honest about then is that the circle, I remembered him calling it the circle, and I remember the early episode of the hijacking, and I was racing through other details in your book that I didn't piece together that hijacking was how the circle operated consistently. That is remarkable that he was hijacking from himself.
Yeah.
Holy macaroni.
Well, that was the brilliance of it, because it's kind of like, let's be legal for as long as possible. Let's cover, let's sort of have our tracks covered for as long as possible, and then just switch it at the end. So it was really, of course, Remus was paying government officials all sorts of bribes and things like that smooth things along for his operation. But it was really a genius plan. It just sort of eliminated the risk in a great significant way, I think.
So I don't want you to just go piecemeal through your book naming character after character, but there is a paragraph that I want to return to, which will tie together the numbers that we've been discussing here, and it will bring in a character who is obviously central to the text as well. And I remember the exact page I want. This morning I went straight to it, and this time I'm leafing through a few pages for dramatic effect. And so I'm on page 158 of the hardcover. And the paragraph, if you don't mind me reading this.
No, please.
Funds to fight the liquor traffic. You'll get to hear yourself in a Scottish accent, so you can see how that sounds to you.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lovely accent, so I'm quite enjoying it.
Funds to fight the liquor traffic diminished each year. Many states had once relied on liquor sales taxes to balance their budgets, and prohibition erased that revenue. Fewer and fewer states spent any money at all on pursuing bootleggers, choosing instead to devote resources to the enforcement of fishing and hunting laws. At the federal level, the government had suffered a loss of 11 billion with a B, that's my editorializing with a B, in tax revenue, while spending 300 million with an M on enforcement. Hence, Willebrand's zeal to prosecute bootleggers for tax evasion. So the Willebrand that you mention in that wonderful paragraph, Mabel Walker Willebrand. Talk to us about her. Give us some taste of her for our listeners when they delve into this book.
Yeah. So Mabel Walker Willebrand, I always love having a strong woman character in my books, and she certainly fits that bill. Mabel Walker Willebrand, just a fascinating person. By the way, also a minor character on Boardwalk Empire. I think they called her Esther Randolph in the show. And she was just this remarkable woman. She sort of started life differently than Remus. In fact, they have some interesting parallels. Mabel Walker Willebrand was, born in the prairies, and she, Remus had to quit his formal schooling at 14. She only began her formal schooling at 14. And she was this really raised in this household where they demanded rigor. Her parents demanded rigor. She read a lot. She played sort of strategic games with her father. One of her favorite phrases was, "Life has few coddled darlings." And she did not consider herself one of them. She took an ice cold bath every morning. One of my favorite childhood anecdotes about her was that she once bit a pet cat's ear, and to teach her a lesson, her father bit her ear in turn, which is so strange, but it's just kind of just shows you she was not sheltered. She, sort of whatever she gave out, she had to take as well. And she was remarkable. So what happened? She was a woman who put herself through law school. She went to California. She became a public defender, specifically taking women clients. She would defend prostitutes, and she was pioneered the practice of forcing the Johns to come in and testify too. So it wasn't just on the prosecutions. The Johns had to come and be dragged into court and sort of have their own shame. And so that was a big accomplishment for her. And the government at this time, William Brandt ended up becoming the second assistant attorney general of the United States. The Republican Party, of which William Brandt was a member, very different from today's Republican Party, I should say. They were eager to curry favor with the recently triumphant suffragists, women getting the right to vote. So they said they're going to replace the first one with William Brandt. And, when she was called upon and when she was appointed by Lauren Harding, for this position, she was only 32 years old. She was 5 years out of law school, and she had never prosecuted a single case in her entire career. And suddenly she's in charge of thousands and thousands of prohibition cases across the country, including cases against George Remus. And I think it's fair to say that her crooked bosses in the White House, Harding included, and her boss included Harry Doherty, all of these men who had quid pro quo and bribe arrangements with Remus and other bootleggers, they've said, let's just put the little lady in there. She's going to be inefficient. She's inexperienced. She's not going to know what she's doing. She's going to be overwhelmed. And of course, William Brandt gets in there and just begins kicking ass. And it was just remarkable. If you could imagine the kind of sexism that female politicians still receive today, you can only imagine. Nobody could report on what she was doing without commenting about her hands and her eyes and her makeup and her figure. And she would write these really great letters to her parents saying, I wish they would stop focusing on that girly stuff, quote unquote, girly stuff, and just talk about my policy. Let's talk about what I'm working on. Let's talk about my accomplishments. And to make matters even more difficult for William Brandt, she was almost entirely deaf. And she had hearing aids, and she would spend an hour each morning arranging her hair to cover her hearing aids. She didn't want people to know that she was working with that handicap. And she wrote these, in letters to her parents. Fortunately, there were many letters to her parents that I was able to go through. She talked about how frustrating this was for her. And, if they think I'm good now, imagine how good I would be if I could actually hear the nuances of the conversation, if I could actually hear what my opponents are saying. I just think she was absolutely incredible. And as one of her friends later on, I think it was one of the lawyers involved with Watergate said, if Mabel had worn trousers, she would have been president. So,
Is there a part for you in writing about Mabel where there's a certain frustration that everything you just said a moment ago and that you talk about in the book, where her figure, her hair, these qualities were included every time, and she says, I wish they would focus on my policies. I feel like you're writing historical nonfiction from 100 years ago and we're no further forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I don't want to say we're no farther forward. Women do have representation in the government, not in the numbers that correspond with their population, their numbers in the population. Of course, if that were true, we'd have 51% women running things. And of course, we haven't yet had a woman president, which is kind of astounding to me at this point that we haven't. And of course, women politicians still get commented on for their appearance, scrutinized for their appearance. But people are also reprimanded when they do those things. It's considered, to be beyond the pale for most of the time, at least in respectable publications. So, if you want to call those some steps forward, we still have a long way to go, obviously. But I think that it's not fair to say we haven't made any progress whatsoever. Yeah.
Good. I appreciate the balance. Do you deal with it yourself? You see it yourself as a female author who has the audacity to go into history? Is that a realm?
I've had that. I will get scrutinized for using novelistic techniques while adhering all to the facts, of course, but in ways that my male nonfiction colleagues do the same kind of thing and don't get called for it. So yeah, and I've had a lot of them say that to me, say, I do this all the time. I can't believe that you were, sort of criticized for that. So yeah, it's happened to me. It's happened to me quite a bit.
Do you feel like there's a difference between a perceived difference between dry and dusty history, that one isn't reading 350 pages in a day and a half, and the narrative nonfiction, that level of engagement that you have within your texts? Do you think there's a difference in perceived seriousness between the two?
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're talking about academic nonfiction.
Potentially, but there's also history put out there for the general consumer that is still dry and dusty. I've got one on the Norman Conquest that I haven't yet cracked the pages of, because I just can't quite bring myself to be that serious just yet.
Yeah, I don't. Everybody has their own way of interpreting history and writing history, and I guess for some people it's more important. I want to present the full story, but I want to do it in a way that's the kind of book that I would like to read. I remember I had one criticism that I didn't go enough into the causes of prohibition and sort of leading up to prohibition and how this actually came to be a law in the United States. And I just felt like saying that it's the kind of review that really annoys me, because it's like, review the book I wrote. Don't review the book that you wish I'd written. You want to read a book about leading up to prohibition and the laws of prohibition? There are hundreds of them out there. That's not the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write a story about a person. I wanted to write about a story in the person who's operating in the confines of prohibition, and how that was a kind of this quintessential American story. And the drama that surrounded that, and how this drama could only ever have taken place in the 1920s. There is no other decade in which George Remus could have existed in the way that he did. That's the book I wanted to write. So I don't disparage anyone who wants to take a more, I don't even want to say dry, I guess just more of a just the facts, ma'am, kind of approach, rather than really sort of focus on the storytelling aspect of it. So it's just somebody's different approach. And if you do talk about academic histories, I have great respect for academics. I'm not an academic. I'm not even a historian. I have a bachelor's degree in English. And but they're great resources, because all of the good stuff is buried in the footnotes. The academics. All of the good stuff is buried in the footnotes. So I thank them greatly for the tremendous amount of research they did. I go right to the footnotes and look to see what story is being buried in there. And again, not to disparage academics, it's a totally, they have a different point, they have a different focus, they have a different objective in their work. But I feel like it's almost apples and oranges, really.
Well, and for the record, I'm married to an academic. One of my very best friends is an academic historian.
Oh, I have. I know, it's kind of like you're saying, well, I have friends that are academics. No, I do as well. And I really, I'm just, I did not have that level of schooling.
So I've got at least two questions rattling around in my brain right now, and I'll try and get them both. But there's a part of this where there's a damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? If you had spent more time writing about the history of prohibition, I would have had an opportunity to say, oh, I wish these pages weren't in here, right? And let's get back to these characters who are so incredibly well drawn and incredibly well developed. And so I could have gone the other way to that review that you had there. And I think you're spot on to say, if that's what floats your boat, go read about that somewhere else. Which then has the question here of, there's a point in the acknowledgements, I want to say, where you're talking about just one experience where you went and scanned 5,500 pages of a trial. And that's already suggesting you've got a lot of information. And I know you've done a wealth of research beyond those 5,500 pages. How do you decide what goes in, what stays out, and when do you decide when the research has to come to an end? Because I imagine that that's quite an appealing part of the process for you.
Oh, it's my favorite part of the process. There's nothing more fun than going off to a location and researching. I think I'm not even exaggerating when I say it was one of the best weeks of my life to sit there in that library in this dank. It was at the New Haven, Yale University Law Library, New Haven, Connecticut, and just parked myself in there from morning to night. I think I brought like a bag of nuts that I would surreptitiously eat when nobody was looking. Throughout the day, I barely took any breaks at all. And it was just this wonderful. Also, there was this wonderful overhead scanner. I have a picture of it that I actually use in my slideshow. It was just this. I know it's going to sound weird, but if there's any researchers out there, it was just gorgeous. I mean, it was like the sexiest piece of machinery I've ever seen in my life. This overhead scanner. Usually it's such a pain to Xerox things. You have to lug the book around. You have to align the pages. You have to make sure everything is correct in the scanner. But this was just, you press the button and this brilliant sunlight came and just came and Xeroxed your pages. And that 5,500 page transcript had just some of the most incredible detail. When I talk about dialogue, a lot of it was in there. I realized at some point during this week of researching this transcript or copying this transcript that I could write this book as a nonfiction whodunit. And what a rare gift that was, because you really never have the source material to write a nonfiction whodunit, where, there's sort of a Chekhov's gun in the beginning scene and, the gun's going to reappear later. But, you have that gunshot and you don't know who is, unless you're already familiar with the story, you don't know who shoots who. You don't know exactly, what the outcome of that scene was. And you just have to keep reading to get to it. And both George Remus and his wife Imogene were certainly capable of murdering the other. So it was definitely an even, 50-50 chance on who's going to get shot here. And it was just so much fun to do that. And so it took me about 4 months to go through this child transcript. And I think the resulting outline was about 97,000 words, which was almost the length of the book itself, which doesn't even compare with the outline I had to do for my next nonfiction, Then Came the Devil, which is at 102,000 words. So yeah, but it's the most, it's fun. It's the most fun part of the process. You're like a detective, you don't know what you're going to find next. And just the process of going through that and figuring out what is necessary, what is a great detail, where it goes. It's just like an enormous puzzle. And I honestly, it's the most fun I've ever had, I think, researching that book. Yeah.
So I know you conducted this research a long time ago and then wrote the book, and then it was released in 2019, and now the paperback is out as well. Congratulations on that.
Thanks.
A paperback release during a pandemic. How was that for you?
It was hard. It was hard because, I ended up doing some Zoom. Obviously, people started getting things going on Zoom. But it was fairly early in the pandemic, so people weren't quite, it was in May of 2020. So people weren't yet really used to logging on to Zoom for an event. And it was hard. It was hard. So I hope never to have to do that again. Obviously, I hope there's no massive pandemic again like that for other reasons. But it was really kind of miserable to have a book come out during that time. And I feel really bad for the authors who had their hardback come out.
Yeah, well, hold on to your monkeypox. Hopefully we'll avoid a repeat of the same. And so the reason I was framing that is then, is there anything on the cutting room floor from your research for The Ghosts of Eden Park that still rattles around in your brain? Is there a thing that happened that doesn't lead to any spoilers for anybody going into the novel for the first time?
Will and Brant was very insistent upon, one of her biggest challenges was finding honest prohibition agents. And, of course, the one she really thought was great, Franklin Dodge, ended up being a major, not the person that she had hoped he was. Of course, he gets tied up with George and Imogene. But she was very insistent upon, to go back to your question, about having honest prohibition agents. And I did a lot of research on the kind of agents that were being employed at that time. And there were some fascinating characters. Izzy and Mo was this duo who, and I don't even know if they were honest all of the time, but there was this duo who would dress up in costume and these very elaborate costumes. They would, dress up as old women or a sort of I think there was one, they would dress up as bartenders themselves. I can't remember all the things, but they had these very flamboyant way of entrapping bootleggers. And there was also a female prohibition agent who was fascinating. There were a couple of them, but there was one who really stood out. She was known to be very brave. She was quick with a gun. Her name was Daisy Simpson, I think her name was. She had kind of a sad story at the end. She got addicted to drugs and had to leave service. But I could have gone on a huge tangent about various prohibition agents who were employed during this time. And although it would have been interesting, it just wasn't, didn't have a place in my book. And the same thing about all the way that people were smuggling alcohol. I talk about this a lot on my slideshow when I do events. The various kinds of flasks and contraptions that people would make. There were flasks that looked like books and flasks that looked like canes. And women were, shoving alcohol in all kinds of body parts and fake breasts and that kind of thing. And the fascinating fact that male prohibition agents, most of whom were male, there were several laws in many states about it was illegal to search a woman. Illegal for a man to search a woman. And women took full advantage of this, of course, and therefore just put alcohol in every conceivable body part that they could think of. So those kinds of things. Even if I touch on it briefly, I could have spent a couple pages on that, and it just wouldn't have served the greater narrative, so it had to go.
Have you found yourself searching out or collecting any of those types of flasks? Has that held any interest for you?
I did, actually. I bought the original ones are incredibly expensive. But I bought a reproduction prohibition cane flask where it looks like just a regular gentleman's cane. If you unscrew the section, there's a glass vial inside. And you can put your alcohol in there, and then you would, surreptitiously pour it into your coffee or whatever. There's a woman, a great picture of a woman smiling widely as she does this in a cafe. Actually, when the bars opened back up after, during the pandemic, when things were starting to open again, one of the first things I did was I went to a bar with my little flask and said, "Oh, it's gonna celebrate the Roaring 20s." So
that is awesome. That's absolutely excellent. Well, in terms, you've seen me sipping along during the interview, despite it being early in the morning. My coffee is not too far away, but I've been sipping on the old Forester, the 1920 Prohibition style release, and it's just so delicious. Absolutely fantastic. And trying to get myself into that time period that we're discussing the morning. This is professional. It's a professional move, Abbott.
Absolutely. I wholly endorse that.
Did you know much about Prohibition going into it? And then, in addition to that, and what was your love of spirits going into the research on this and then the ultimate writing?
That's a good question. No, I did not know a lot about Prohibition. I usually go into my subjects pretty blind on the larger picture, and part of the great fun is even just learning. Of course, I knew the rudimentary elements of Prohibition, but not the specifics, and just sort of getting a broad base of knowledge about that was very interesting. As for spirits, I never drank like whiskey. I always preferred clear liquor or wine. More wine than anything. I'm a kind of a wine. I really have like taken studied wine and that kind of thing. But I met there was a woman who worked for George Remus brand whiskey. I think her name was Robin Carnes, and she made the most delicious whiskey cocktails that I've ever tasted. And I never thought that bourbon could be refreshing. And she actually made bourbon refreshing. And so ever since then, I have been a fan of bourbon. I won't drink it straight. I still have to have some other things for it to pal along with. But I really enjoy the bourbon cocktail now.
Nice. I'm not asking for measurements or the recipe, but do you even remember the core ingredients that would allow it to be refreshing? Was it maybe just a high quantity of ice? It's fine if you don't remember. I forget cocktails all the time. Yeah,
it wasn't the ice. She made one taste kind of like a bourbony lemonade. That was really good. It kind of just had a tartness to it. So I do have to get back to my bourbon cocktail making. It was quite delicious and lovely.
And again, I'm not going to be able to give you the recipe either, but we've been talking to our listeners about a Toronto. Over last Thanksgiving, I started making a Toronto, and for the simple syrup, it uses maple syrup, and it's just an absolutely delicious bourbon cocktail. And boy, do you lose an afternoon quite easily on it. And it was perfect around Thanksgiving time. I'm down here in Virginia, and it just fit the season so well. Really, really delicious.
I'm going to have to look that up. Thanks for the recommendation.
Yeah, no worries. I'll email you the recipe that I use. There's, I think, a standard Toronto, and then there's a wrinkle with the maple syrup. And I can send you the version. Again, because I don't remember much of anything, I keep it on my phone, and so I've got the Toronto ready to go on my phone.
Very cool.
Yeah, let me know what you think of it. So one of the things for me is, and obviously today we in our own way are pulling you back in time to when you were researching and writing, and then more regularly talking about the ghosts of Eden Park. On a personal level, something I'm very, very excited about is your next narrative nonfiction called Then Came the Devil. And we were talking a second ago about having friends who are academics. I was an academic for 12 years teaching philosophy, and one of the philosophers I actually taught a course on a couple of times was Friedrich Nietzsche. And I see mention of Friedrich Nietzsche in the prologue posted on your website, and I'm curious about a host of things here. So please just wax lyrical. I'm interested in, what the book's about, how you got the idea for that, the research conducted about that, the prologue that's online. I thought, oh, this is online. I wonder how much this will stay and how much you might find yourself changing it. How's the writing going? And when do I get to see this? When do I get to read this in a very selfish way? So that's 5 things. If you cover them all, great. If you don't, great. Wax lyrical about the next thing.
Yeah. So the next book is Then Came the Devil, as you said. Part of my problem with doing Remus is I don't know how I am going to find a story weirder than that one. I don't know how I'm going to top it in terms of subject matter. And of course, then Came the Devil, I think, is even weirder in a good way. I love weird stories. I love strange characters, eccentric characters. But I had come across this story a long time ago. I was thinking about taking a trip to the Galapagos Islands. And if you start reading any literature about it, usually it mentions if you're going to visit the island of Floriana, it's the island of secrets. Here's the weird history and how it's kind of haunted and cursed and this kind of thing. And the story in a nutshell is a German doctor and one of his patients who becomes his partner decide to leave Berlin. It's the lead up to World War II. The fall of the Weimar Republic is approaching. Hitler is coming into power. They leave and they decide to try to set up a utopia on the Galapagos island of Floriana, which is very small, very remote, one of the most southern islands of the Galapagos. I just visited there in May, and it still only has about 200 people on the island. Everybody knows everybody. There's 2 bars. Of course, I had to go to both of them. And, they do this. And he was a very eccentric, weird guy. He was a big, a pioneering proponent of raw food and the benefits of water. And he had all these experiments he wanted to conduct on the human body in the Galapagos Islands. He even extracted all of his teeth before going over there because he was worried about having dental problems that would not be able to be addressed in a remote island. So long story short, because obviously it's a book-length story, they start settling in their life down there. Things are tense once in a while. He's such a crazy egomaniac, and she is his disciple and alternates between wanting to please him and feeling in alignment with his philosophy and being like, oh my God, this guy is terrible. And you could just read, her writings and just like the constant internal struggle she had of talking herself into thinking this was great. And another family comes over from Germany. They are not pleased about this. They wanted solitude, but they start coexisting fairly peacefully, these 2 families. But then all hell breaks loose, of course, when a woman calling herself the Baroness arrives with 2 lovers in tow. And she proclaims that she's going to turn the island of Floriana into Miami and build an American-style hotel. And meanwhile, American explorers are starting to come over and be fascinated by these people. There's competition and just sort of all kinds of nefarious happenings. And in the end, a couple of people are dead, a couple of people are murdered, and the American explorers are sort of left to pick up the pieces and try to solve the mystery of what happened. And I'm having just as much fun researching the American explorers. They had a really huge hand in the story. I did at one point, the United States was considering buying the Galapagos as just a nature preserve. They wanted to, they knew best on how to preserve this great wildland. Of course, the United States thinks that, and just sort of, what these millionaires were doing during the 1930s when everybody else was suffering greatly with the Great Depression. And this sort of glamorous, I think it was kind of the first era of really glamorous, exotic boat travel, yacht travel to these islands down in the South Seas. And it became sort of like a competition among these millionaires as to who could have the bigger yacht, how many islands can you go to, what exotic species can you bring back for your local zoo. And of course, they brought back these animals that don't exist anywhere but the Galapagos Islands and bring them to the San Diego Zoo and don't know what the hell to do with them. So just kind of like this confluence of factors that I just think, and to me, it also became a COVID book. I really started getting into this during when the lockdown was happening, and everybody was like, I just want to go to a desert island. I just want to get away from everybody. I need solitude. I need isolation. I need space. And so it also takes a look at the dangers of extreme isolation. I think we could all say that we were affected during COVID, being isolated, and here's just an extreme version of that. It's almost like an early version of reality TV, this whole escapade. And also the thing I think of when I'm writing it, is adult Lord of the Flies, really, the adult Lord of the Flies.
Interesting. It's interesting because on your website, I think you've got the exiles and the explorers separated into 2 groups right now, where you can see, perhaps 2 narratives being set up for the text.
Yeah. So I'm in the middle of writing it. I probably have about 35,000 words, but I had to put it aside for a bit to work on edits for my novel. So right now I'm not in the 1930s. I'm going back between the 70s and 80s. So yeah, which sadly is also history at this point.
It's interesting because as I've gone from Sin in the Second City with you, there we were at the turn of the 20th century with these wonderful sisters. And then I went into the 20s with you, somewhat in Chicago, but predominantly in Cincinnati. And now you're going to take me off into the 30s and from Germany off to the Galapagos. And so it's interesting how you yourself are moving through these decades. And then you mentioned the novel where you've got the 70s and 80s. Are there days when you just kind of look around yourself? Oh, gosh, the necessary question is the second season of Russian Doll. Are you a Russian Doll fan on Netflix?
No, it's in my queue. And I love Natasha, right. But I haven't. I know I have to watch it. I got caught up in various other things. In fact, I just only watched The Crown, which I know is like many years too late. So it's like I will get to it. It's in my queue.
Okay. Just the decade hopping that's going on in that second series, where you have those moments of where the hell am I? Highly recommend. So are you aware of that kind of passing of decades yourself, and even within your own research and writing?
Yeah, I try not to visit the same. I mean, I would revisit the same decade if it's an entirely different story, but I haven't done that yet so far in my nonfiction. The time, the setting of obviously the year and the era a book takes place is just part of its setting. So it's kind of like, in addition to familiarizing yourself with the characters and the plot and the sort of subtext of what these people were doing, you're also looking at what did the 1930s look like? What kind of radios were there? What would a yacht look like in the 1930s? What were they wearing? What music were they listening to? What kind of thing, exactly what was happening with the recession? How much was the price of a loaf of bread at that time? How much more difficult would it have been to be living on a remote island where, I mean, one of the things I learned by traveling over there was I can't even imagine living there today. And even with the conveniences of electricity and Wi-Fi, spotty Wi-Fi, but Wi-Fi. And these people were going over there in the 1930s when they had none of that. And also this woman had multiple sclerosis. I mean, and it was kind of like just to get a pail of water, you had to trek miles, and just kind of remarkable. So I just think that whatever you're setting your book in, it's just as important to focus on the minutia of how the world had shifted in that space as it is to look at your characters and your plot and your outline and where you think the story's going to go and how can you arrange the parts into the most satisfying whole.
I tell Dexter is saying, listen, you've been talking to this jamoke for far too long. You got to pay attention to me at some point.
I'm so sorry.
No, not in the slightest. This is wonderful color. We're keeping in Dexter for the listeners. But I have many, many more questions, but I'm going to get you out on one more, which is we speak to producers of whiskey about the passage of time. And so when you make new make today, and that goes into a cask, you might not see it. We might not see it as a consumer for 3 years, 5 years, 10, 12, 30, right? And I always ask the producer of that whiskey, do you get impatient? And my closing question for you, Abbott, is we're sitting here talking about all the work you've done, all the research, all the writing, then the going out and the selling the book as it exists out in the world. And then I show up and I say, I read that in 24, 36 hours. When you giving me the next thing, right? Time for me as a consumer looks very different for you as the producer. And so how does it feel to know that there's time for you to be putting in here? There's a certain exploration and research and writing, and people who are now dedicated fans of yours are saying, next thing, next thing, next thing. What's that like?
Well, it's one of the reasons I wanted to get into fiction, because you can write it much faster than you can nonfiction. And I have novel friends who are like, God, I haven't had a book come out in 2 years. People are going to forget me. I'm like, I have 5 years, and obviously you expect that with nonfiction. There's a much greater span of time because you have to actually research and fact check and do all of that. But it's kind of gratifying now to know that if I can start a career writing fiction, at least in addition to nonfiction, if not solely, that I could maybe just start having more out there. Nonfiction is difficult in the sense that if you pick a nonfiction book, you better make sure you want to live with that for the next 4 years. Or 3 years, or however long it takes you to do it. It has to be something you're excited to turn to every day, or else it is the longest, most interminable, horrible slog that you can imagine. And so, again, that's another reason nonfiction is hard. You have to find all the factors that go into picking a nonfiction book. But it's gratifying to see people are like, faster, when's it coming out? And you're just like, I still have 5 archives to visit, in addition to writing, in addition to editing. So it's just nonfiction's a different beast. So hopefully with fiction, I can at least get a little bit of quicker momentum going.
Well, and I would think at this point, as much as I've talked about the 2 books I've read, you do have another 2 narrative nonfiction.
Yes.
One on the Civil War.
And one on Gypsy Rose Lee and the sort of entertainment of the 20th century. Yeah.
And so while I am impatiently waiting for Then Came the Devil, you're going to get me to read about the Civil War, which is something I just simply don't read about. I read about so many other things.
Yeah. But living in Virginia, yeah, there's a lot of, it's all around you. Yeah.
Which is also why I'd spend a lot of time avoiding it. You go out for a loaf of bread, you go past a Civil War site.
No, it's true. I used to live in Atlanta. In fact, I got the idea for that book while I was living in Atlanta and stuck behind a pickup truck with a bumper sticker that said, "Don't blame me. I voted for Jeff Davis." Which,
So perfect.
Oh God, I mean, perfect and hard. It's just awful. And in Atlanta traffic, I was stuck looking at that for about 2 hours. And, I was like, okay, this is telling me something. I have to look into the Civil War. And of course, the female Civil War spies is where I landed. So,
man, wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for today. Thank you so much for your time. I've taken you away from researching the very book I want to be reading.
Well, I hope we get a chance to speak again when Then Came the Devil comes out.
That would be fantastic. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much.
Jason Johnston Yellen, you have done it.
Well, that's not nerve-wracking in the slightest.
Jason Neil Johnston Yellen.
I know.
Right? Is that
that's
better?
Exactly it. I would say that's what my mother said when I was in trouble, but I was never a Yellen until I left home and got married. So, but Jason Neil Johnston certainly got thrown around a few times.
Well, it was so...
Sorry if I'm slurping my coffee there. Didn't mean to be quite that noisy.
You always are when you slurp. So it's like ramen. That's etiquette, right? You're meant to be slurping. You're meant to hear those. You're meant
to show your enjoyment,
right?
Yeah.
It's such an enjoyable conversation, and it's one of these things where you said, "Hey, I've got this book. It's the second book from this author that I've read. I really want to speak with her." And it was a book that I hadn't heard of, an author that I hadn't heard of, but the subject material sounded good. And I kind of feel like one of our listeners where I said, okay, I've trusted you in the past. I'm fine with this detour. And it was awesome. It was a really cool conversation. And again, I wish I could have been a part of it, but maybe next time, maybe for her next book.
Well, actually, as you heard us discuss towards the end of that interview there, her next book is Then Came the Devil. And I am super excited for the launch of that. I'm ready for another reading experience that you just plow through. Very quickly, before we do move on here, Seabass,
yes,
Christopher Sebastian, who we mention a bit here, he and I often have some book recommendations going back and forth.
Yeah.
And I had reached out to him to say, dude, you have to check out The Ghosts of Eden Park. And he wrote me back and he said, I've seen that cover and that title floating about.
Yeah.
And so, now I'm going to go get it. And I said, look, we're going to interview the author next episode of One Nation Under Whiskey. And so he's trying to get the book read before this episode comes out.
Speed it up, Seabat. Oh, well, actually, he can if he can't.
And now here we are.
Yeah, I can't tell him to speed
live.
up after he's heard the interview. Anyway. That's
so good.
That's cool. Good. Actually, you reminded me, we talked about Seabass quickly in our last episode and mentioned that I got a chance to hang out with him because he and his family came to Connecticut. And I remember in the episode I said, oh yeah, I did want to tell the listeners about that meetup, and then I never got to it really quickly because it involves New Haven pizza, which I think is very important, Jason.
I don't think I've ever heard you talk about New Haven pizza.
Well, we met up just for about 2.5 hours. We met at Bar, which, as you know, and any listener with ears and memories will tell you Bar is my favorite pizza place ever, period, done. And so we met there. We got some beers, and we got a mashed potato pizza. And then we got the elote pizza. Did I tell you about the elote pizza?
Oh, I had it last time I was there.
Yeah. So those were the pies that we got. And he, Seabass, had said, I'm sold. He loved it. He took some back to his family.
Did they have any takis for the elote pizza this time?
Not only did they put the Takis on the pizza, but the Takis were bigger. Like before, it was almost like Taki dusting. And this time around, it was like good bits of Takis on the pizza. And it was a bigger, it amplified the experience. No doubt about it.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Yep. But just a wonderful guy to hang out with, easy to talk to, had a lot of good laughs, got to learn about him and his wife and a bit about his family. So that was nice. I'm glad we met up.
Awesome. Well, we have run the gamut from Karen Abbott Kahler, to Seabass, to New Haven Pizza, to Bar, to Takis. We should probably wake up the paperboy next.
Extra, extra! Read all about it! Life story of Playboy Penny! Extra, extra! Extra, extra! Read all about it! Me and that Playboy in trouble!
Our last episode, where you and I just got to sit and chitty chat with one another, which is always a highlight of any week, got some really good feedback from our listeners. And I think, our listeners enjoy the camaraderie that exists between us. And here we are, and also I think the transparency with which we
Operate,
interact with our listeners, And so we've been talking for a while about global logistics and the struggles with global logistics. There's that knowing chuckle, right?
Here we go.
Who were we talking to the other day? We were talking to Matt Hoffman, and we started talking global logistics, and he had that kind of knowing chuckle, and it's just like, yeah, we're all in the same boat right now. But we had a good experience where global logistics actually operated quite well and quite quickly.
Yeah, it almost felt like before times.
When we didn't use air freight.
But yeah, right. So this is perfect. I'm so glad you brought this up. We'd mentioned on the podcast previously that not only had ocean freight, if we're talking shipping time from Scotland to the U.S. or where we warehouse, which is in California, San Francisco, with our friends at Impex, normally that ocean freight would be 2 months, 2.5 months, 3 months on the outside, but that was really it, right?
Honestly, I remember really in the beginning, we were getting quotes of 6 to 8 weeks.
6 to 8 weeks,
and,
yeah, that's a good point.
And we would never bank on 6. We would never bank on 6. But 6 to 8 became weeks, became 2 to 3 months, became good luck.
6 to 8 weeks became 68 weeks. But then, it wasn't just ocean freight that was affected by the global pandemic and, extending those lead times, like you'd said, from 2 to 3 months to 5 to 6 months. And in some cases to 9 months or more. And air freight as well. The way air freight worked was you get your shipment ready, you call your global shipping logistics partner to arrange for a pickup. And between the time of that first conversation and the time the shipment arrives to the warehouse is around a week, right? That's how it takes for setup, for pickup, for loading, for flying over, for unloading, go through customs, get to your warehouse. About a week. That then extended to a month, maybe a little more than a month. And part of it is just accessing these containers that were held up in China because China remains, in many parts, to be in lockdown because of COVID. So anyway, with this shipment, Jason, that you were talking about as we were coming out of the Paperboys rant, we were fully expecting to wait about a month, maybe 5 weeks to get our shipment. And what happened?
Well, I like what you said there about the initial request for quote and then all the clearing that happens. And we just had this conversation the other day. It was 2 weeks.
Yeah.
It was 2 weeks from quote to landing, which
Huge.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
Really remarkable.
So, I mean, part of me hopes that this is the direction we're headed in, but part of me, the cynical part, right, is like, I'll
yeah, go on.
well, like that hopeful part of me, and I'm not trying to be political. We always try to stay away from politics, but I remember after the George W. Bush administration, towards the end, we were going into recession, and then Obama was voted in, and about a year or two into his presidency, as we're coming out of the recession, I remember him saying, "We're starting to see these green shoots." Right? These things that are telling us maybe we're coming out of this. And there was that hopeful sense to the words that he was using. And when we saw that the shipment had come in 2 weeks rather than 5 to 6 weeks, all I could think was, is this our green shoots moment with global logistics, or is this just a fluke?
I've just been sitting here listening to our tone, and we've been describing good news like it's bad news. like we're so weighted in our enthusiasm that it's kind of like, and in this instance, it was 2 weeks, and that felt great. But we're not sure if we will feel that greatness again.
Wow.
Like we're so measured.
So very measured. Yes.
But here's the takeaway. Here's why we're talking about this. Here's why we're bringing it up. We gave a bit more detail in the last episode when it was just the two of us, and we were kind of really expanding upon our list. And in this instance, we're saying to you, if you're US based, and we've got a lot of stuff coming to the online nation here, we're going to take some time. We're going to take a month, maybe a couple of months to get these released, to get these out, to get the word out about them. We're doing what we've always done, which is we're continuing to push the envelope, and we're bringing in our first release from Paul John that has gone online. Jess did have a Rest of the World Paul John that was very well received.
Yep.
And a few bottles of that are on their way to Canada right now.
Oh, I'm so excited it's in Canada.
So if you're a Canadian SCN fan, you've got some retail Paul John heading your way. So here we are with the nation. Our first Paul John for the nation.
Peated Paul John.
We've got our first Swedish whiskey going out to the nation with the Mackmyra. 13 years, virgin oak cask. Fantastically exciting stuff. Fantastically exciting. Joshua holding up a little sample bottle that I sent him.
Beautiful color. Can't wait to do the tasting video on it.
Right? And so there's some new coming in there. We've got a return to milk and honey with a couple of casks, one of which was a peated cask. So we're always excited to continue the relationship with M&H and the good people in Tel Aviv there. And then as we talked about, we've got first fill bourbon that went into first fill sherry with a Dal Ewan.
Oh my gosh, Jason. We are not color guys. We say this all the time, but holy crap, the color on that Dal Ewan is remarkable and only supports the remarkable flavors coming through. Like, that color is usually an indication of your level of sherried component to the whiskey, and it is so there. However, that Dal Ewan spice just remains. This one is really, they're all belters. But being a bit of a Dal Ewan fanatic, I'm just over the moon with this one.
Oh, without any shadow of a doubt. Without any... And I think it's also nice... I think sometimes when you get that real dark sherry in a finish, it's building on top of much quieter flavors where maybe you've had refill, American oak or something like that. Here we've got first fill bourbon, right? So that has some presence.
Yeah.
Then you've got the Diluent Spirit, and then you've got a very active sherry finish on it. There's a lot to it, and I know, and I'm hearing it from the nation. There's a building love for Diluent, and you and I have led the charge, and you and I have clearly said we are rapidly becoming big Diluent fans, and the nation is getting a chance to join us in that.
I think you could say Dalu and I. Dalu and I have been getting into it. See that?
There you go. Diluent and I.
And so
You could say that. You might not want to, but you
not.
could say that.
Right. So I think you've covered them all. Peated Paul John are 2 M&Hs, one from an ex-Isla cask, one from a first fill bourbon. Or Macmira, which is from Virgin Oak. And I just took a sip of this. This is people with a bourbon palate are really gonna glom onto this one well, I think. And then our Diluent. So what is that? 6 new whiskeys coming your way.
Is that really 6?
Is that 6? No, it's 5. Is it 5?
I'm only counting 5.
Yeah, it's 5. There you go. It's like is it? No, it's not even a baker's half dozen.
The other thing I would say is we've also got a couple of special private club picks going on that will move through the back end of the nation. But depending on the purchasing from those clubs, we might have some leftover bottles as we've had in the past.
That's true.
And so we'll be letting the nation know if we've got any leftovers there as well. And those are both cracking casks.
Yes, yeah.
That people will be clamoring
Let's
for.
not say anything, just in
I'm not
case the
going to.
clubs buy them all.
Exactly.
Just in case.
I'm playing
Holy
it
crap.
safe.
Yeah. So there you go. I mean, to my mind, that was the news that I wanted to share. I didn't know if there's anything else you wanted to add on before we moved on to something else.
I will indeed, because we're building the Cask Pick program within retail and among distributors. Mm-hmm. That's Elijah's baby. We talk about Jess and what Jess works on as global sales manager out of Glasgow. And Elijah has really been putting in yeoman's work to build that program. Mm-hmm. And he's going to continue spreading the word on Instagram, the banter around the barrel.
Yep.
That he has been putting in. He'll be talking to store owners who made the pick. He'll be talking to reps who are in charge of helping to sell some of those distributor picks. And so really, follow that, right? Go look at, Single Cask Nation on Instagram is where we make sure that word is getting out. But he's putting together a great little program there. The list is longer than we can possibly deal with.
It is
right now.
It's one of those tough positions we're in where we have a set number of casks each year that we could do a single cask program with, and typically that program closes around June, if not earlier. Especially if you want to get it in for October, November, December. And it is nice, right? It's nice to have a longer list than we can satisfy. It's like one of those, good problems to have kind of thing. So to add on to that, you mentioned the Scotch malt whiskeys, you mentioned the rums, but there's also some ryes as well that Elijah is working with too, and we want to expand that too come 2023, 2024. So if you're a club, if you're a retailer, if you're a distributor that buys Single Cask Nation, please reach out to us. We'll get you in touch with Elijah, and know this. We do have a long list. We do want to work with people when and where we can.
It's nice to have this, this international side to the picks, and then this domestic side. Having a domestic component is really cool.
Yeah.
And I don't think we're going to be done at Rise. But again, I'm not going to say too much.
Oh, cool. There were some emails I wanted to bring to our attention. Email number 1 came in from Sean Parent, who was a highlight of our last episode.
Indeed. That was a great original email he sent in.
And so the subject for those that either may not have listened to last episode, A, go back and listen to last episode,
100%.
or
yep.
B, had forgotten the subject line of Sean's email. It was, "Did I buy the wrong bottle?" And the story was he bought a bottle for his sister, and it was sort of on a suggestion from us. We talked a lot about Lafroig, and he bought a Lafroig for his sister. It was Lafroig Select, and his sister's boyfriend was not too impressed by the bottle he got. So we waxed lyrical about that. Again, go back and listen to the episode. Anyway, I reached out to him and I said, "Hey, not sure if you got a chance to listen to last episode, but we did highlight your email." To which Sean's response said, "Hey, Joshua, I've not heard the episode yet, but I may jump ahead to that episode to hear it." And this is what I like, because I'm with him. Full disclosure, I am a completionist and am playing catch up. I've just hit the summer of 2020 episodes, and I'm listening to how you both wrap your heads around the pandemic. Thanks for addressing my email, and I will be listening to that out of order.
So this is interesting.
Yeah.
Because in our response, when we were waxing lyrical in the last episode, we talked about the episode we put together that was your 5 whiskeys that should be on every shelf, my 5 whiskeys that should be on every shelf. And knowing where Sean currently is, he hasn't reached that episode yet.
Yeah.
And so he's going to get that revelation as well. Revelation as well.
Yeah, he's not going to revel. Rella?
It's a bit like fork. You just say it enough ways and enough different tones, and it's like, I don't think that's a word anymore.
Wait.
So
Fork. Fork.
Knife will do it as well. Knife will get you.
Spoon.
Right? It all becomes ridiculous after some period of time. But anyway, it was interesting that we made reference to that episode and he hasn't heard it yet. So I think that's going to be good. And I think, as he was saying towards the end of his email, don't forget to drop in the occasional nugget for us newbies. I think that episode with these 5 whiskeys that should be on your shelf from each of us, I think that's a great place. We should remember the episode number for that one, because it would be a good one to drop in regularly, especially as we start getting into the gift-giving months.
That's a good point. That is a very good point.
I'm full of good points. I'm a regular Hellraiser.
I don't have anything to say to that. Anyway,
Is it Pinhead?
Pinhead.
He's full of good points.
Oh, he is full of good points, isn't that? He will tear your soul apart, Jason.
See that? I referenced a little bit of horror for you, and you didn't get the reference because I don't reference horror.
Which is, right, I didn't expect. It's like getting a horror reference out of context. And that was one of my favorite stories growing up, because I was a big Clive Barker fan. The movie was terrible. I revisited Hellraiser, and as spooky as Pinhead was and all the Cenobites, I know you're hating this, our listeners are loving it. Like, they were all spooky, but the movie was just, ugh. Anyway.
I don't mind telling you how many of our listeners reach out to say, I'm so glad you hate horror. I also hate horror. But that's a conversation
no one says
for another day.
No
so please move along.
No,
please
everybody
move
loves
along.
horror. So we got an email from Tim Mushaw about our last episode. We got a lot of people reaching out about our sort of catching up episode. So it's nice that people like it.
Yeah, agreed.
And so I'm going to go through this point by point. It's not very long, but here we are.
Classic Joshua.
Well, it's a good size. It's a good size email.
So obsessed by length. So obsessed.
And girth. Like, that line arm was not just short, but it was also very slim.
Narrow.
Slim pickings. Anyway. The subject line.
The blues artist?
Yeah. Slim pickings. Sun, what's the blues player? Sun King? Robert Johnson?
At least when we drink during our episodes, when we get to this point, we make no sense. There's at least a reason. Today, not a drop of alcohol has passed our lips, and we've still reached the same stage of words on top of words, followed by words.
The caffeine got me there, Jason. So Tim Mushaw's email simply is titled "This Week's Podcast." Tim says, "Hi folks, fun episode this week. It was like listening to the intro, but like you forgot to put the interview before moving to the news." and
A fine observation.
And you're going to like this next sentence too, because this talks to the part where we're doing some blind tasting and you were giving me some tasting notes and you're like, how are you not getting this based off of this tasting note?
Yes.
Which was orange spiced gumdrops. And so he says, I was pleased to be one of the ones shouting at the radio when you, Joshua, couldn't guess a couple of the whiskeys you were drinking. The American Light Whiskey and Ardnamurchan were so obvious from the clues given. So not only was he on me, he was on you with the Ardnamurchan.
He's on both of us. Yep. Yeah. I'll actually tell you right now, Jess had said that Ardnamurchan was obvious. And again, I was just like, top 5 distillery? Like, you kept blocking me with that line. And then, here we are.
To be fair, I've simply had more Ardnamurchan than you, being with Impex. And yes, that was hashtag humble brag. Being with Impex, I get to taste a lot of what's coming into the U.S. and some of the samples. And now I've started buying bottlings from the UK. I used to focus on bottlings from Imperial because no one knew about them, and I could easily get them for a fair price. People have started discovering Imperial, and I'm not going to pay.
That was me and my Lechigs.
Yeah, exactly, right?
That was me and my Lechigs, man.
People have yet to fully discover Ardnamurchan, and so here we are. So anyway, speaking of Ardnamurchan, Tim goes on and says, I was so pleased to hear that the Ardnamurchan has moved up to the top 5 in Joshua's list. They're high up there for me also, and I'm looking forward to following their journey from the ground floor. Big kudos to Impex for importing them for us. Looking to do the same with Loch Lee once I can get a bottle. I've been a John Campbell fanboy for a while. I don't think he's alone in saying that.
Speaking of the Loch Lee, and I ask this for personal reasons, and I'm happy to get the answer for other folk as well. How is the importation of the first 2 Loch Lee releases looking?
So there is good news. And the good news is that the Loch Lee first edition, as well as the Sowing edition, which had spent months on the water. Remember what we were saying in the news, right? Where 2 months turned into 3 months, turned into 5 months, turned into more. That is what happened with Loch Lee, but I'm really happy to say that product has finally hit the U.S. and it's starting to get onto store shelves. So it's
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's both the first release and then their quote-unquote Sowing edition, which will be a limited edition. And then later this year, again, this is in the hopes that the global logistics gods smile upon us, we will be seeing 2 other editions come in. I don't want to say any more than that. But having tasted them, I'm really excited for them. It's, people have asked me, well, how is Loch Lee? It's a lowland distillery. What's that going to be like? And if we think back to our conversation with David Ferguson and John Campbell,
indeed,
I think, John basically said, and of course I'm paraphrasing, he said, the lowlands are just a geographical, that just happens to be where we are geographically. We're not out there to produce a lowland style of whiskey. We're out there to produce whiskey that we think is excellent. And so, having tasted through various Loch Lee whiskeys, they're not all that softer style of whiskey. There's presence. There's, we talk sometimes about whiskey bottles, and you could just look at a whiskey bottle that has a proud shoulder to it, and it looks rough and tough and just, sure of itself. I think Loch Lee is that type of whiskey where it's very sure of itself. It has subtleties, but it's not as if that's all it has, right? There's a lot going on with these whiskeys.
Yeah, I'm excited to get that first release and the sewing edition into the collection, onto the shelves, get them open, get them tasted. I still have not tasted a drop of Loch Lee. I'm holding out for the first release. I'm waiting.
Yeah.
And to hear that we can start sourcing that from some shelves as we keep an eye on it is very exciting. So cheers for the update.
Yeah. There was more in the email, but the rest of it is more just for us internally, and I've already responded to him, so there's no need to read the rest there. The last thing that I will say is, off the back of our last extra episode where we talked about American single malt, we had asked people to reach out and let us know what they thought about that nomenclature of American single malt rather than single malt American whiskey. And people have started writing in. So we'll bring up an email or two in our next extra. And then finally, our good friend Ollie Chilton reached out with a suggestion on an article for extra. So we'll see if we can get to that.
All right.
He also had a ton of opinion in that email, so I think we may want to get to that one. He's an opinion that we always value and like sharing. So, or I should say, his is an opinion we always value and like to share. Because Ollie is not an opinion; he has an opinion.
And yet, many people have opinions about Ollie.
So that's all we have for mail. I wanted to just put out one last thing, because we have been getting in some really good reviews on our Apple Podcasts, and we're now officially over 100 reviews, which has me over the moon.
Oh, wow. That's very cool.
Yep, we're at 102 reviews, Jason.
That's insane to me. It's really insane. If you think about how many listeners it takes to generate one review, and we're over 100. That's very cool. Thank you, dear listeners.
So this this review came in July 25th from someone named Not Impressed at All.
Well, here we go.
And here we go.
Batten down the hatches.
The title is The Rating Scale is Lacking Stars. And so Not Impressed at All actually gave us 5 stars, right? When I saw that this person's handle, I'm like, oh shit, we're in for it. But then they're basically saying there's not enough stars for this podcast. So I'm going to read you the content here. So it says, the pad cost that rules them all.
Sorry, I didn't hear the rest of the words after pad cost. I was too busy celebrating. Say that again.
The pad cost that rules them all.
Oh, nice. Thank you. One pad cost to rule them all. And in the darkness bind them. Let's bring it.
If you're a real whiskey geek, this is your go-to place for anything that happens in this industry. I thoroughly enjoy listening to these gents. There's always something new to learn, something to spark reflection, and always, that's all caps by the way, great entertainment. Whether you're relatively new in the field or if you're a more seasoned whiskey enthusiast, the One Nation Under Whiskey. Oh, that's funny. So it ends there. It sounds as if they may have hit the maximum number of characters.
How many are you allowed? That wasn't a lot of words, was it?
It wasn't a lot of words, but let me read this again. Whether you're relatively new in the field or if you're a more seasoned whiskey enthusiast, the quote, ONUW, end quote. And that's how it ends. I think
Maybe
it was
there's
like,
going to be a sequel.
oh, there may be a sequel. Do you think there'll be a prequel? I think it's like a choose your own adventure. How would you end that statement, Jason? If you're new to the field, or if you're a more seasoned whiskey enthusiast, the One Nation Under Whiskey podcast
is short and narrow, but has big spirit.
Oh, that's good. All right. Yeah, now you pose it to me.
I don't have to. I can't read it. You've got to.
Oh, okay. So
you pose it to yourself.
Okay. You didn't memorize what it said?
And your answer, Joshua?
So whether you're relatively new in the field, or if you're a more seasoned whiskey enthusiast, the One Nation Under Whiskey podcast is your chance to do the Humpty Dance. To do the Humpty Hump.
Thanks for this opportunity. Not at all impressed.
I tell you, not at all impressed should be not at all impressed with how I ended his sentence. To be fair, I wasn't at all impressed as to how I ended his sentence. Or her sentence.
Or her sentence is exactly correct, Joshua.
Yep, indeed. Well, if you, dear listener, want to be like Mr. or Ms., not impressed at all, you please go to Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review, preferably 5 stars, 4 if you have to, and put some kind words down. Maybe finish a sentence or two, and we'll go ahead and read it. There's a few more that we need to read, so we'll keep peppering them within these episodes.
This is delightful. Yeah, I love it. I really appreciate anybody going over there, taking the time to write a few kind words. It really means a lot and helps other people find us and boosts us up the rankings, and it helps us get discovered by more people. Mm-hmm. So thank you. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. So, Jason, that about does it. I want to thank you, first and foremost, for reaching out to the author, Karen Abbott. Thank you so much to her for being willing to speak with you, talk a little bit about her writing and the writing process. And I need to pick up this book, and as well as the first one.
It is also available in audiobook, so as you're driving around the world, you will be able to listen to it. So.
You have spoken to my heart, Jason. I'm going to get that in audiobook. Oh,
I know you.
Beauty. Thanks as always to the listeners, to Not Impressed at All, to Tim, to Ian, to list. Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate you listening to us and supporting us along this way. So I'm going to raise my sample bottle to my other sample bottle.
All right.
To say,
I'm going to raise my coffee cup to my water glass.
Cheers, Jason.
2 chins.
2 chins. God, yours sounds really bad.
I thought mine sounded better than yours.